So the first speaker I'd like to introduce today is, and it's my honor to introduce her, is my friend and our friend Barb Whyte, Elder Barb Whyte of the Comox First Nation. Elder Barb is a descendant of the Pentlatch and Sathloot peoples and has brought a wealth of wisdom and cultural knowledge to share with the Hornby community over the years. She's involved with a number of our organizations here on Hornby. Today, Elder Barb will be speaking about the history of Cedar, the tree of life. Barb, please come up and join me in
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Bree, for inviting me here today. Yes, my name is Barb Whyte, and I was born Barbara Billy. I'm a descendant of the Pentlatch people on my mother's side, and descendant of the Sathloot people. Descendant of the Pentlatch people on my father's side, descendant of the Sathloot people on my mother's side. And as a member of the Comox First Nations, I'd like to welcome you all to the unceded territory of the Comox people. The Pentlatch territory starts just past the Condensary Bridge in Courtenay, and it goes right down into the States. And on the mainland, it starts at Mount Currie and goes to Kwantlen, is our borders on the mainland. So we have quite an extensive territory for the Coast Salish people. The Sathloot people were the people that used to live in Deep Bay. Deep Bay was our last settlement that I was born in. We got evacuated there in 1958 with a land scandal that where they took our lands from beneath us and we had to move. The Sathloot territory used to include Denman and Hornby. Denman Island used to be the largest settlement of Coast Salish people on the coast. That's how much has changed since 1958. And it was before 1958 that our Indian agent that we had in this area had sold most of the lands on Hornby and Denman, and Deep Bay was the last Sathloot territory where he sold the lands in a land scandal. And so it's unfortunate how for us Native people who cared for the land so much has changed for us since 1958. It wasn't until 1958 that we were allowed to hire a lawyer. It wasn't until 1958 that we were allowed to go to school, a public school, and receive public health care, and were able to shop off reserve. It was just before 1958 when the Indian agents came in and they confined us to our reserves and moved us from the places where we used to live and put us in confined areas. We lost control of our land when that happened. I'm a person that I was born in Deep Bay in 1970 or 1947. 1970, I'm still thinking. And in 1947, things were a lot different back in the day. This is when the lower island highway was just being constructed at that time, and they're just starting to fall the trees for that main highway. Before that, it was just a trail. That original pathway for our old highway was a trail that apparently my grandfather would go shopping with a wheelbarrow back in the day before they had a road for cars. And James Ford, as you know, had a horse and carriage that he used to use for transportation over on Hornby. And a lot of the people that lived on Denman and Hornby used to use their boats to get back and forth before the ferry came in. So prior to the ferry coming in, there was lots of trees that were still here on the islands. Many things have changed. At one time, the Aboriginal people knew how many cedar trees that they had in their area. The cedar tree was a tree of life for us. We used to be able to, they would count the cedar trees, and that's how we would build our houses, was according to the number of trees that we could get a plank out of. We never used to fell the tree in order to use it for lumber. We used to just take one plank off the side of the tree, and the tree would continue to live. So that's how we built our houses. As to the number of trees that we were able to take a plank out of would account for the number of houses that we were allowed to build that year. So back in the day, on Bayside Road, which is Bayside Road today, at the base of Comox Hill, there was 6 big houses that used to be down there, and the fish weirs are the visible pieces that are still left. And the fish weirs are made out of cedar as well. The fish weirs are made out of the small branches of the cedar. And they've been in the ground for 100 years, and they're still intact. My brother was working on the fish weirs, was working as a guardian when they found the fish weirs, and he was the one that found the gate to the fish weirs. So up until then, we thought they were fish weirs, but they're actually fish traps, because we found the gate that would hold the fish in when the tide went out. So the cedar was able to stay preserved. The gate was still intact. The only things that were gone, that were missing, was the pieces that wove the slats of cedar together. Those were disintegrating, and I'm assuming that was stinging nettle rope that they used to tie things together with. And they used cedar roots as well for rope to tie things together with. And we couldn't tell which product was used to tie the cedars together. But yes, at one time we used to know how many trees that we had in our forests, and that determined the number of houses that we would build out of the cedar tree. We also used the cedar tree for the beams for our houses. The branches, the bigger branches, were used for the beams, the support beams, and for the support posts. And as we know, and as you've seen in our history books, we used the cedar tree for our totem poles that were out in front of our houses, and the totem poles is who identified who lived in that house, because our crest was what was on our totem poles in front of our houses. And so we used to use the cedar tree also for paddles for our canoes. We know of 2 different types of cedar tree, red and yellow cedar, but the native people call the trees that grow under the branches that grow close to the juniper underneath the fir trees. Those ones were used for different things. Each tree was used for a different thing depending on where they lived. So the planks that we used for our homes, that was a tree that would grow straight, so it was more in the sun. The trees that we used for paddles, for hooks and other things to support our daily life were trees that were growing under juniper, that were growing under a canvas that would make them more crooked and more branches. So you would get a different type of a tree. You couldn't make a canoe out of a straight tree that we used for planks for our homes, because those are the canoes that would split when they got into rough weather, because the grain was so straight. So the ones that they used for canoes were ones that had a few knots in them, then the knots would hold the canoe together when we were traveling. So there's really 4 different types in our eyes. There's 4 different types of cedar trees, depending on where they're growing. And as we all know, that the forest is a companion planted garden. So everything that grows in the forest complements one another in how they grow and how we use them. And so the number of, as we see now, because of the clearing, I believe it's partly because of all of the fir trees being cut out and the canopies being destroyed that the cedar trees used to live under. That, I think that is why a lot of our trees, our cedar trees, are going. And also the fact that they have such shallow roots that kind of sit on top of the soil. They don't have the taproot that the Douglas fir does, for instance. So that's changing with a lot of the moisture that is missing from our Mother Earth now, and the changes that we're going through in the global warming. And we also use the branches. We use the bark, the inner bark of the cedar tree. That's what we use for our hats and our clothing. And to make it soft, we just pound it a little bit more to make it soft for clothing. When we used it for our hats and things, it was to be waterproof. So we left it more plain so that the oils would still be in the cedar to repel the water for our hats. Our first thing that we used for a headdress was actually the headband. And so that was mostly used just for those that were dancers and had titles to them. The cedar hats came in after the Chinese people started visiting us, and we started copying their hats. And then a lot of people now wear cedar hats. It's something that's not left with it for a certain person of entitlement. It's more of a generous offer for people to have a cedar hat now. And the cedar roots we used for watertight containers. The cedar roots are a little bit more difficult in gathering, I find, than the cedar bark. You have to cut the cedar root up a little bit more because it's round in shape when you bring it out of the earth. And then we cut it into angles when we weave it, and it becomes a waterproof vessel. The cedar roots do. So that's what we used to use for our teacups and water vessels and things like that. The looser ones were the ones that came, the products that we got from the bark were the looser weaving ones that we used for hats and clothing. And we used to also use those for mats. The mats would be something that we would use on the ground for sleeping, and in the daytime we could put them up and use them for our temporary walls in our big houses for privacy during the day. And then the mats were also used at one time on our boats, and that would be on our canoes, and that would be the shelter piece that we would create when we're traveling. Because at one time we didn't have ferries, so we all had to have our own individual boats to get back and forth, especially on Hornby and Denman, and that's how we kept in touch with the people on Hornby. My mom used to be a fisherwoman, and she would trade fish with the Ford family for their fruits and vegetables, and then the people had to travel by the tides when they came to do their shopping from Hornby and Denman. So a lot of people stayed at our houses because the tide would sometimes be in the evening, so they'd have to stay overnight and catch the high tide back home again. So a shopping trip back in the day was 24 hours rather than the whole day that you have to spend now with the ferry services. But yes, we use cedar for our lifestyles. It supported every part of our life. It also was used for our tools. The knots of the cedar tree were used for fish hooks. They were steamed in steam plankers. My dad's boat was made out of wood, so we had a steam vessel at home. It was just a long, great big vessel made out of metal, and Dad would put hot water in it, and that's how we used to steam the planks in order to replace planks on the boats that were wearing through. And that was the typical way that we used to steam the wood in order to bend it for tools and for fish hooks and different things like that. And there's also the spiritual use for the cedar tree. The cedar tree was one of our most precious trees that we had in the forest because it supported so many parts of our lives. Today I use the cedar tree mostly for smudge sticks. The needles of the tree, to me, the cedar tree carries the energy of Jesus, which helps with everything. And the branches are also used for brushing, along with hemlock. Hemlock branches are also used for brushing, and that's a very special tree to us as well. And not to forget the medicines that are in our trees. The cedar tree gives us mostly spiritual medicine. Some people drink cedar bark tea. I choose not to drink the cedar bark tree because it has little slivers in it that stay inside of our body if we don't filter that out enough. I use the hemlock and your balsam trees and your fir trees. The fir tree gives us quite a bit of pitch in the bark. If you see the little blisters in the bark and you crack them, you'll see the sap that comes out. That sap is very high in antibacterial and antivirus medicines. It helps with colds and it helps to heal wounds. You can use the pitch on an open cut that's infected and it will help to heal that cut. And if you drink it as tea, it helps to prevent colds and flus from happening. The pitch is used as a salve. You can buy that in our grocery stores now, and it's mostly used as a skin salve for wounds. And it's antibacterial and antiviral. So there's many, many uses for the trees. I use the tips of the fir trees. I pick them every spring and I use them for tea, and that does the same thing for me. It helps to prevent colds and flus. And that's what they use for the pycnogenals that you see in the health food stores. Pycnogenals is sold to most people for arthritis, to help them with their arthritic pain, and that comes from the tips of the fir trees. So most of our trees, you can use the tips of the trees for tea, and it helps with viruses and bacteria. And the spiritual pieces are to cleanse the heaviness off of our bodies, any heaviness that we feel. And when we're finished using those branches from the hemlock or the cedar tree, we're supposed to hang them. Most people don't do that now, but we're supposed to hang them so the wind will cleanse out the debris that is gathered from our aura when we brush with it. So those are just some of the things that we use the cedar tree for. There's many, many other things. But I find that most people think of trees as shade now, but there are many, many values that can support our lives in a good way. And I hope that we're able to keep some of our forests going. I collect plants. I'm a wildcrafter, and that's how I support my health, and I help other people with the health as well. And there's many, many changes that are happening in our forests now with the wild plants as well. Because the trees are our canopies, and all the things that grow under it are going to change as well. So how are we going to take care of all of those things? I'm talking to Island Health and saying that the plant medicine garden that I planted at the hospital is now going to maybe become a species garden, because a lot of the things that we're able to pamper in that garden may not be able to live out in the forest. So that's something that maybe we could think about. The City of Courtenay is asking me to do to create a forest walk in the city for them. And I said, do you realize that most of our forests, the healthy forests that we have, are all companion planted? And that it would take a bit to create a forest walk, but I think it's something that we should all start thinking about. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Barb. It's fantastic, thank you. Okay. Did you want to run out for a second? Just while Grant runs an errand, I'll be introducing him as our next speaker.
That's an old guy thing.
We probably have a few minutes if Barb's willing to answer any questions while Grant stepped out of the room. You okay with that, Barb? Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, did you ever use the acorns from the Gary oak trees?
I don't remember a use for the acorns, but when we were kids, we used to pick tree cones and sell them to the forestry. We used to buy them in the sacks from us to use them for seed. Other than that, I don't know of any use for the Gary oak. Yes.
My question goes to the remark you made about the cedar hats being made as an imitation of the Chinese hat. So I'm wondering what contact, was this for the Chinese immigrants in the 1800s, or let's go back to an earlier time?
That could go back to an earlier time when the ships were coming over for trading, but when we started changing our design, it wasn't until the early 1900s, because the cedar band was what most of us wore back in the day, and the cedar hats came in the early 1900s. And the cedar hats are different in Haida than they are here. We weave ours so that the wind can go through. It's more of a shade hat. And when you do a cedar hat from Haida, it's done with a half hitch knot that keeps it waterproof. So it takes a long time to make a Haida hat.
Okay, one more question at the back here.
Elder Barb, how should we treat the knowledge that you've just shared with us?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. I think that every time we go out into the forest, we should show compassion for the forest in whichever way we can. To be healthy, of a light mood when you go out there, and to really appreciate Mother Nature. Our world has gotten so busy and noisy that we often don't appreciate the noise and the sound that you hear and feel when you go into the forest. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you very much, Barb.